November 1944. The Philippine archipelago stretched across the horizon like a chain of shattered bones rising from a black and indifferent sea. Dawn had not yet broken. Instead, a pale smear of gray seeped into the sky, dissolving night without delivering morning. The air tasted of iron and salt, thick with humidity that clung to skin and metal alike, heavy enough to press against the lungs. Clouds hung low and swollen, promising rain that would turn soil to glue and trenches to drowning pits. The world vibrated with a low mechanical hum, generators idling in the distance, the muffled turning of engines submerged beneath tarpaulins, the restless shifting of steel against steel. But beyond that industrial pulse, there was silence. No birds, no wind, no gunfire, a silence so full and dense that it felt like a held breath stretched to the point of pain. It was the kind of silence that exists not at peace, but on the razor edge before catastrophe. On the western ridges overlooking the shattered shoreline, thick black plumes of smoke still rose from yesterday's bombardment, curling and twisting like broken fingers clawing upward, refusing to release their grip on the sky. The ground was scarred by shell craters filled with stagnant water and slick layers of oil, reflecting a distorted image of the heavens above. The smell, burnt rubber, cordite, diesel fumes, and something else, something metallic and unmistakably human, settled over everything like an invisible shroud, turning each breath into an act of endurance. In a shallow basin carved into the jungle floor by retreating armor, a Sherman tank sat half buried in mud, silent and inert like a corpse abandoned on a battlefield no longer cared about by either side. Its olive drab paint was scorched and peeling, its right track torn apart in a violent spray of twisted steel links, its engine housing cracked open from the concussive force of a near-miss bomb strike. Wire spilled from its rear like ruptured veins. The main gun, a once confident symbol of American armored strength, hung at a defeated downward angle, the barrel gouged and dented by shrapnel. Rainwater pooled in its open hatches and spilled down the sides, washing thin trails of rust along its armored plates. Around it lay fragments of tools, broken shell casings, torn canvas, and the splintered remnants of crates that had once held spare parts now scattered uselessly across the ground. It looked less like a weapon and more like a monument to failure, a relic already outdated amid the relentless churn of war's machinery. The jungle around it trembled with distant vibrations. Something moved beyond the tree line, not machines, but men. Footsteps softened by mud, the subtle rustle of uniforms brushing foliage, the occasional clink of a sling or bayonet. Japanese infantry advancing cautiously, sweeping forward through fog and undergrowth, tightening a noose around the battered American positions left clinging to the ridges. Inside the shattered perimeter, among oil-soaked tools and twisted cables, one man knelt beside the broken Sherman. His hands were black with grease and grime up to the wrists, his fingernails cracked, his knuckles bleeding from impacts against metal edges. His name was never recorded in headlines or commemorative plaques, and after action logs, he would be identified only by a rank and a last name that generations would forget. He was a mechanic, not a commander, not a celebrated ace, not a metal-polished officer. His job was maintenance, troubleshooting, keeping engines alive rather than commanding them into battle. But war does not choose its heroes from those prepared to be remembered. It chooses them from those who refuse to surrender when surrender seems inevitable. He knelt with his head lowered, listening not to orders, but to the faint vibration of approaching boots through the ground beneath his knees. He heard the war closing in. He had watched the crew evacuate the Sherman hours earlier, believing it beyond recovery. He had watched stretcher teams carry away the men who should have fought inside that steel hull. He had heard the whispered understanding that this tank, crippled and abandoned, was now nothing more than a landmark marking the edge of defeat. But he did not walk away. He ran his palm over the shattered armor, as if feeling for a pulse, as if searching for something still alive buried beneath iron and mud. The field telephone lines were down. The radios crackled only with static. The artillery observers had gone silent. Somewhere beyond the ridges, the last functioning Shermans of the company had already pulled back to reorganize, leaving this isolated pocket exposed and nearly blind. The mechanic shifted his weight, stood, and walked around to the rear of the tank, his boots sinking into mud that grabbed at his ankles. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, smearing black streaks across sweat-dampened skin. The engine compartment gaped like an open wound, the Liberty V-12 inside exposed and shuddering slightly, as if struggling to draw its final breaths. A bomb fragment had torn through the cooling manifold and shattered several feed lines. The right bank of cylinders was frozen solid. One magneto was ripped apart. Hoses were severed. It should not have been possible. It should not have been attempted. But the mechanic leaned forward and began working, his movements sharp and decisive, his breath shallow and rapid. There was no workshop, no crane, no replacement parts except those scavenged from wreckage and improvisation born of desperation. The only light was the ghostly gray of pre-dawn filtered through thick clouds and smoke. His tools were dented and slippery, their grip worn smooth. He worked by instinct, drawing from memory built over years spent in motor pools from New Jersey to New Guinea, repairing tanks that had lived through storms of steel and fire. His hands moved quickly, stripping twisted housings, pulling bent tubes straight with brute force, sawing apart damaged lines to splice together fragments into something barely functional. He tore insulation from blown wiring and replaced it with strips of uniform cloth dipped in melted paraffin from emergency candles. He used parts of ration can lids as makeshift shims. He replaced a shattered manifold cap with a hacked piece of steel plate scavenged from a destroyed half-track, hammering it into place with the butt of a wrench. The mechanic paused only once, listening again to the distant approach of enemy soldiers. The jungle to their south was beginning to crackle with gunfire, short, tense bursts from rifles probing the darkness. Flares streaked upward, faint orange arcs that sputtered and dimmed before being swallowed by clouds. Somewhere out of sight, an American machine gun nest opened fire, its rhythm uneven, desperate, before falling silent. The mechanic closed his eyes for a moment, not in prayer but in calculation. Time was collapsing around him. He leaned forward again, tightening bolts with trembling hands as sweat stung cuts and soaked into grease. A second crewman approached through the fog, limping, blood seeping through makeshift bandages tied around his ribs. He crouched beside the tank and spoke in a hoarse whisper barely audible above the steady percussion of distant artillery. The mechanic did not lift his head. He continued working, the wrench biting into metal, his voice a blunt rasp. "Keep watch. Tell me when they're close." The wounded man nodded and turned away, lifting a carbine to his shoulder, eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the broken tree line. The mechanic did not look up again. His world narrowed to a single objective. Not victory, not glory, ignition. He reached inside the compartment and grabbed the starter lever, fingers slipping from oil. He wiped them on his uniform, gripped again, and pulled. The engine coughed once, a broken exhale of steam and fumes, then fell silent. He spat into the dirt, adjusted the fuel linkage, checked the alignment of the patched lines, and pulled again, knuckles whitening with effort. This time the engine rumbled, sputtered, screamed in mechanical agony, and stuttered back into silence. A mortar round detonated somewhere nearby, showering mud and leaves over the wreck. The ground shook. The mechanic pulled again. The tank shuddered violently. The engine backfired with a deafening crack, black smoke erupting from the ruptured exhaust stack. The wounded crewman flinched, thinking it shellfire. The mechanic pulled again, harder, body straining. A roar exploded from the engine bay, coughing and uneven, but alive, a jagged, snarling vibration that shook the ground beneath them. The tank trembled as if waking from death, metal plates rattling in protest, bolts vibrating, patched hoses quivering under pressure. Smoke poured out in thick billowing clouds, filling the air with the choking stench of burning fuel and scorched oil. The mechanic staggered backward, chest heaving, his face streaked with sweat and soot and rain. He slapped the armored hull with his open palm, once hard, like striking the shoulder of a friend rising to its feet. The wounded crewman turned, eyes wide with disbelief. The mechanic climbed onto the hull and dropped through the open turret hatch into darkness that smelled of cordite, rust, dried blood, and gasoline. He reached for the controls, his hand shaking, and pressed the starter again from inside. The engine roared louder, steady now, a savage and uneven heartbeat pounding through steel ribs and welded bone. The whole tank lurched. The ground trembled. From the tree lean came shouts in Japanese, urgent and sharp, their cadence accelerating with the realization that something impossible was happening before their eyes. When the engine roared back to life, fate shifted with its first breath. The Sherman shook violently as power surged unevenly through the damaged drivetrain, the hull rattling like a living thing dragged back from the edge of death. Warning lights flickered erratically across the interior panels, gauges trembling at redline levels, the entire machine vibrating with a metallic growl that sounded less like an engine and more like a wounded animal refusing to die. The mechanic gripped the controls, his arms trembling under the force of the vibration, teeth clenched as he forced the transmission lever forward. For a moment nothing happened. The ruined right track sat motionless, half buried in mud and shattered stone. unable to move. The tank lurched sideways, metal screeching in protest as gears ground against each other. Sparks burst from a damaged contact panel above his head. The engine coughed and nearly stalled, the roar dropping into a desperate choking rattle that shook his bones. He slammed his fist into the throttle housing, forcing it open, and the engine howled in response, surging with raw, brutal force that pushed the tank forward an inch, then another. Outside, the wounded crewman turned and stared, unable to believe what he was seeing. The mechanic drove his shoulder into the lever again, and the tank lurched harder, dragging itself forward through the mud, tearing the broken track links farther apart, shredding sections of steel that had once been precise, ordered, and strong. The machine was no longer a weapon designed by engineers. It had become something primal, destructive, and furious, a beast refusing to die quietly. The jungle ahead erupted with gunfire. Tracer rounds streaked through the fog, like sparks ripped from the mouth of a furnace. Japanese infantry surged from the treeline in a sudden, coordinated push, rifles raised, bayonets glinting under the dull gray light. Their shouts cut through the air, sharp and fierce, echoing across the ravaged battlefield. Mortar rounds began to fall in tightening arcs, explosions thundering closer with each impact, spewing dirt and metal fragments into the air. The wounded crewman by the hull opened fire with his carbine, each shot deliberate and controlled, but his ammunition was limited and his stance unsteady. Bullets tore into the ground around him, kicking up dirt and splintered stone. A round struck the tank's hull with a sharp metallic clang inches from his shoulder, showering him with fragments that sliced across his cheek. He staggered, raised his weapon again, and fired until the bolt locked back empty. He did not throw the rifle aside. He held it in his hands like a lifeline, throat tight with rage and desperation. Inside the tank, the mechanic slammed his palm against the transmission housing, forcing the battered gears to catch. Something inside the drivetrain snapped with a sharp metallic crack, but the left track surged forward, grinding through soil and stone. The broken right track tore free completely, the links scattering behind like dismembered limbs. The tank lurched violently to one side, but momentum carried it forward, dragging its crippled body across the battlefield. It was no longer a functioning armored vehicle. It was a moving wall of steel driven by stubbornness and fury. The mechanic gripped the controls, leaning his entire weight into the steering levers, wrestling the machine like a bull trying to throw its rider. Sparks flew from the exposed metal of the track assembly as steel scraped against stone. The hull tilted dangerously, slipping sideways into a crater filled with black water. But the mechanic forced the engine harder, redlining it until smoke filled the interior so thickly that he could barely see. The Japanese infantry in front of the tank hesitated. They had expected resistance, perhaps a firefight, but not a dead tank resurrected into motion. They stared in confusion, disbelief flickering across their faces, uncertainty spreading through their ranks like a ripple through tall grass. Fear is a strange thing on the battlefield. It can arrive without warning, born not from overwhelming power, but from the refusal of something to die when logic insists it should. The tank dragged itself forward another meter, then another, engine roaring with a sound so violent that it drowned out the rattle of machine gun fire. The mechanic lowered his head, wiped burning sweat from his eyes, and shoved the turret traverse mechanism with both hands. It groaned, resisted, and then turned slowly, painfully, inches at a time. The main gun shifted upward, trembling like the hands of a man trying to lift himself after a beating. The firing mechanism was damaged, the breech ring scarred from shrapnel, but the loader had prepared a single round before being evacuated, a high-explosive shell already seated in the chamber, waiting only for the hammer to fall. The mechanic reached for the trigger mechanism, fingers slipping on grime and blood. He heard footsteps closing rapidly outside, the wounded crewman collapsing against the hull, shouting warnings through the hatch. The mechanic did not respond. He braced himself, exhaled once, slow and steady, and pulled the firing lever. The tank bucked like an animal struck by lightning, the explosion within the breech chamber deafening inside the armored shell. The recoil rocked the entire chassis, shaking bolts loose and cracking weld seams. The round streaked across the battlefield and detonated in the midst of the advancing infantry, a violent eruption of fire and splintered metal that flung bodies into the air like rag dolls. The shock wave rippled outward, flattening foliage and scattering men who had thought themselves safe behind the jungle's cover. The screams that followed cut through the smoke like tearing fabric, raw, terrified, disbelieving. The mechanic re-gripped the controls before the echoes had faded. He forced the tank forward again, using the remaining track like a paddle, dragging the steel carcass in wide grinding arcs that chewed up soil and stone. He aimed the hull directly at the densest cluster of infantry, the tank turning into a battering ram of armored mass. Men scrambled to escape its path, tripping over roots, falling into mud, dropping weapons as panic overtook discipline. Some fired wildly at the tank, bullets sparking harmlessly against armor. Others threw grenades that bounced from the hull and detonated behind it, rocking the machine but failing to stop its advance. The tank plowed through underbrush, snapping saplings like twigs, pushing bodies aside like grass against a plow. The mechanic could not see clearly through the smoke and shattered periscope glass, but he did not need to. He felt the battlefield in the vibration of steel, the scream of gears, the shuddering impact as the hull struck obstacles and ground them beneath its weight. The wounded crewman clung to the rear hull, holding onto a welded handrail with blood-slick fingers, his face contorted with pain and adrenaline. When the tank reached a rise overlooking a shallow ravine, he dropped to the ground and crawled toward a fallen Japanese automatic rifle, dragging himself through mud and debris. He rolled onto his back, propped the weapon against a shattered tree stump, and opened fire into the ravine below, where another squad sprinted toward cover. His rounds cut through them, tearing through uniforms and flesh, sending them tumbling into the water below. His aim was steady, his breath short and ragged. He fired until the chamber clicked empty, then reached for another magazine with shaking hands. Inside the tank, the mechanic reached for the turret traverse again, forcing the mechanism to shift despite grinding resistance that felt like metal screaming. He aimed toward a machine gun, nest being set up behind a cluster of rocks. The loader seat beside him was empty, streaked with blood. He reached down, grasped the shell by its base, and dragged it upward with a groan of effort that pulled at the muscles across his back like tearing cloth. He slammed the shell into the breech, locked it with a kick of his boot, and pulled the firing lever. The blast shook the tank violently, knocking tools from racks and shattering the last remaining gauge glass. The nest vanished in a cloud of pulverized stone and smoke. The mechanic gripped the firing handle again, but the breech did not open. The recoil system had seized, bent and warped from the stress of battle damage. The main gun was finished. The tank roared anyway. The Japanese infantry regained some discipline, reorganizing into flanking positions, rifles raised. Officers shouted commands, swords lifted to direct lines of fire. Mortars began dropping shells again, explosions walking closer in tightening patterns. The wounded crewman shouted a warning, but the mechanic did not hesitate. He shifted the tank again, dragging its broken body sideways, grinding steel against rock until sparks flew in bright orange bursts. He positioned the hull between the wounded man and the advancing troops, turning the Sherman from a weapon into a shield. Bullets struck the armor in rapid succession, a storm of metallic impacts ringing through the interior like hail against a cathedral roof. The mechanic ducked instinctively, gripping the controls tighter, feeling the steel shudder as rounds ricocheted and flattened. Mortar fire intensified, smoke blooming across the ridge in thick choking plumes. A shell detonated close enough to lift the tank 3 inches off the ground, slamming it down again with a force that rattled the mechanic's teeth and drove pain through his spine. But the engine kept running, screaming through damage and strain, held together by bolts, wire, willpower, and something that cannot be engineered, refusal. The mechanic did not look out the hatch. He stared ahead, eyes burning through smoke, breath ragged. He reached for the .50 caliber machine gun mounted atop the turret, but its ammo belts had been soaked in mud and water, jammed beyond immediate repair. He turned instead to the hull-mounted .30 caliber, grabbed the grips, and slammed the trigger. The gun erupted in a long, roaring stream of fire, brass casings raining across the floor, smoke choking the air, bullets ripping through advancing infantry and tearing through leaves and bodies alike. The recoil hammered into his shoulders with each burst, but he continued firing, sweeping the gun across the field, mowing down soldiers who darted between trees in desperate attempts to close the distance. The wounded crewman stood again, leaning against the hull, firing bursts with the captured automatic rifle until the barrel smoked and the wood stock burned against his hand. He shouted hoarsely, urging the mechanic on, urging himself not to collapse, urging fate to hold for one more minute. The explosions grew louder. The jungle screamed with gunfire. Smoke rolled across the battlefield until shapes disappeared and shadows moved blindly within it. The tank's engine began to sputter again, coughing in violent staccato bursts as fuel lines strained under pressure and overheating pistons hammered with uneven rhythm. The mechanic slammed the throttle again, forcing the engine to keep breathing, keep burning, keep fighting. The tank lurched forward, dragging itself like a wounded animal into the ravine below, crushing stones, wood, and bodies under its weight, descending with uncontrolled acceleration until it struck the opposite slope and shuddered to a halt. The battlefield fell silent for 3 long seconds, a silence thick and heavy, like the pause after a scream before the next breath. Smoke rolled away slowly, revealing stillness where chaos had been moments before. Bodies lay scattered across the ground in torn uniforms and broken helmets. Rifles floated in water whose surface rippled with drifting ash. Steam rose from craters and shattered trees. The tank rested half buried in mud and rock, its engine coughing weakly, exhaust pouring in thin, ghostly trails. The mechanic pushed himself up from the gunner's seat, blood dripping from a cut above his eye, breath heaving. He looked through the cracked vision slit and saw movement. Japanese soldiers retreating, some dragging wounded, others staggering in shock. 28 enemy soldiers had fallen in the span of minutes at the hands of a man who was never trained to be a hero, inside a machine that should have been buried. War is not won only by strategy or firepower or command. Sometimes it is won in moments when one man refuses to let fate decide the ending. The ravine echoed with fading cries as the surviving Japanese troops withdrew into the jungle, their retreat marked not by organized cadence, but by the stumbling chaos of men who had glimpsed death wearing unfamiliar colors. The mechanic exhaled slowly, his lungs burning from smoke and exhaustion, his chest heaving with the uneven rhythm of a man who had crossed the threshold between survival and oblivion and found himself still breathing. The tank around him groaned with settling metal, the engine coughing and sputtering like a dying heartbeat struggling to continue. Steam vented through cracks in the armor, rising in swirling tendrils that mixed with the drifting smoke from burned brush and shattered earth. The mechanic placed his hand on the instrument panel, feeling the warmth of the machine radiating through trembling steel, as if he were touching the chest of a living creature whose life depended on his will alone. He closed his eyes and let the silence settle, feeling the weight of the moment press against his ribs, heavier than the armor that surrounded him. Outside, the wounded crewman slid down along the side of the hull, collapsing to the mud with a gasp that sounded more like relief than pain. He stared upward at the tank with a mixture of disbelief and awe, his hand pressed over the bleeding gash in his side, blood seeping through his fingers and soaking into the fabric of his uniform. He whispered something too soft to be heard above the hiss of steam and the crackle of burning vegetation, his voice thin and ragged. The mechanic emerged from the turret hatch like a man rising from underwater, his face streaked with soot, blood, and engine grease. He blinked against the light filtering through the smoke and slid down the side of the tank, boots sinking into mud. He landed hard, knees buckling for a moment before he steadied himself and crossed to the wounded man, kneeling beside him. The crewman looked up at him, eyes wide with the hollow brightness of someone who has seen the line between life and death and now stands on its trembling edge. Neither spoke. Words would have broken the fragile gravity of the moment, cheapened it, diminished it. Silence held more truth than language could contain. The battlefield spread out below them like a scar carved across the land, churned earth torn open by artillery shells, trees snapped like brittle bones, smoke curling upward in thin columns from cratered soil. The bodies of fallen soldiers lay scattered across mud and rock, limbs twisted in unnatural angles, helmets cracked, rifles lying beside them like discarded arguments. The ravine water ran red in thin streams, diluted into pale pink as it carried fragments of leaves, dirt, and blood downstream. The air smelled of cordite and burning wood, of engine oil and soil torn from its roots, of iron and smoke, and something human that lingered beneath the surface like grief. The mechanic scanned the horizon, eyes narrowing as he watched shapes moving through the distant trees, retreating figures shrinking into the mist, vanishing like ghosts into the jungle. He knew they would return. War never ended with a single moment of defiance. It only paused long enough for breath. The Sherman tank, half buried and broken, stood behind them like a monument carved from steel and stubbornness. It leaned slightly to one side, hull cracked, treads torn away, turret blackened from smoke and fire. The barrel of the main gun still pointed forward at a slight upward angle, as though refusing to admit defeat even after the last working mechanism had failed. The hull-mounted machine gun sat silent now, barrel glowing faintly from heat, smoking gently in the cool air. A single bullet hole pierced the metal near the mechanic's shoulder level, the edges bent inward sharply where hot lead had struck with deadly intent. The tank was a ruin, but a ruin that had defied expectation, logic, and odds. It had stood between life and death, between survival and annihilation, and it had moved. The mechanic placed his hand against the side of the hull, resting his palm flat against the steel. It vibrated faintly from the last dying rotations of the engine, a trembling pulse fading slowly like breath leaving a body. He closed his eyes and whispered something under his breath, not words of victory or pride, but something quieter, something closer to gratitude or mourning. The tank was more than a machine in that moment. It was proof that resolve could reshape fate, that when death closes in, the will of one man can pry open a gap wide enough for survival. He lifted his head and looked toward the jungle where the enemy had vanished, feeling the exhaustion in his bones begin to settle into deeper layers of muscle and thought. His hands shook from adrenaline draining away, fingers trembling as though suddenly stripped of purpose. War has moments when time fractures, seconds stretching into lifetimes, lifetimes compressing into seconds, and he knew that what had happened here would live in memory long after this ground swallowed the smoke and the bodies. The wounded crewman coughed, and the mechanic turned quickly, sliding his arms beneath him to lift him higher against the hull, shifting him so that his head rested more comfortably. The crewman's breath stuttered, chest rising unevenly as pain sharpened his features. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, drifting in and out of the thin line between consciousness and collapse. The mechanic tore a strip of fabric from the crewman's sleeve and pressed it hard against the wound, fingers digging into the flesh to slow the blood flow. The crewman winced, teeth clenched against the agony, but he did not cry out. He placed one hand on the mechanic's wrist, grip weak but deliberate, grounding himself against the haze of shock. The mechanic spoke softly now, voice steady despite the roar still echoing through his skull, promising help, promising movement, promising survival. He did not know whether any of those promises were true. He made them anyway. The jungle around them shifted with the low groan of wind through broken branches, leaves rustling with the cautious movement of unseen animals returning to ground scarred by violence. The battlefield, so loud moments before, now lay in near-complete silence, punctuated only by the crackle of distant fires and the intermittent whine of twisted metal cooling under open air. Silence after battle is a strange thing, not peaceful, not tranquil, but charged, electric, filled with memory that has not yet settled. Every sound echoes louder in the absence of explosions. Every breath feels heavier when measured against the silence left behind by those who will never breathe again. The mechanic scanned the horizon again, eyes narrowing against the glare of sun breaking through thinning smoke. No movement, no advancing lines, no shouts, no gunfire. For the first time since dawn, there was space to think, space to feel, space to acknowledge the enormity of what had happened. He shifted his weight, sliding his arm beneath the wounded crewman's shoulders, preparing to move him toward whatever shelter or extraction point might exist beyond the battlefield. He did not yet know the direction. He only knew there had to be one. Survival begins with motion, even when every muscle begs for rest. He rose slowly, lifting the wounded man with him, staggering under the weight as dizziness washed through him in waves. He tightened his grip, forced his feet to plant firmly in the mud, and took the first step upward toward the ridge. His boots slipped once, sliding in the wet earth, but he caught himself, leaned into the slope, and pushed onward. The body pressed against him felt lighter than expected, not physically, but in the way a man carries responsibility when he knows its weight matters more than his own strength. Every step burned, every breath scraped against smoke still coating the inside of his lungs. Every heartbeat hammered against his ribs like a fist demanding to be heard. But he ascended. Behind them, the Sherman sat half submerged in mud, its turret tilted slightly, gun barrel angled upward just enough to appear defiant. Sunlight broke through the clouds, striking the steel surface in a band of dull brightness that glinted faintly through soot. It looked almost like a monument erected to honor the dead, not solemn, not mournful, but resolute, something that had stood between fate and finality, something that had mattered. The wounded crewman's breathing grew steadier as they climbed, his head resting against the mechanic's shoulder, eyes half open, watching the broken battlefield recede below them. He whispered something again, voice thin and fading, and the mechanic nodded without slowing his pace. He did not need to hear the words to understand them. Words at the edge of survival are rarely about explanation. They are about truth. They reached the ridge and paused, the mechanic lowering the crewman carefully against the trunk of a shattered tree, leaning him into the rough bark so that he could rest while breath returned. The mechanic wiped sweat and blood from his forehead with the back of his hand, staring back across the battlefield. Smoke drifted upward like ghosts returning to the sky. The broken tank stood alone, silent and still. The enemy bodies lay scattered in twisted poses that reminded him more of abandoned marionettes than fallen soldiers. The jungle beyond the clearing shifted again in the wind, leaves whispering like distant voices. The mechanic listened for engines, for footsteps, for any sign that the silence would break again. There was none. War is not a single battle or a single moment or a single victory. It is a chain of choices made under pressure so great that the world seems narrowed to a pinhole of breath, instinct, and will. It is a space where logic collapses beneath urgency, and survival hangs by the threads of decisions made in seconds. And sometimes, rarely, the course of battle pivots not on strategy or command or overwhelming force, but on one man who refuses to let death decide the ending. The mechanic looked out across the wreckage, and the weight of that truth settled over him, like dust settling after an explosion. He had not intended to become anything more than the man who repaired the machine. But machines break. People break. Moments break. And when they break, someone must step forward into the space left behind. He looked down at his hands, trembling, blackened with grease, streaked with blood both his own and others. They shook not from fear now, but from the release of everything held tightly while survival demanded stillness. He clenched them once slowly, feeling strength return like water filling a cracked vessel. He turned to the wounded crewman and nodded once, a quiet promise that the moment was not the end. He lifted him again, bracing weight against his shoulder, and stepped away from the ridge. The jungle closed around them, dense, humid, alive with sounds beginning to return as the forest reclaimed ground briefly stolen by war. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with unseen danger, shadowed by the probability of pursuit. But the mechanic continued forward, step after step, breath after breath, carrying the man who trusted him, leaving behind the broken steel that had carried them both through fire. He did not look back. The jungle thickened as they advanced, the foliage closing in like a living wall reshaping itself around the narrow trail they forced open with each step. Every branch brushed against their shoulders like hands reaching from the shadows. Every rustle beneath foot, sounding too much like movement that belonged not to animals, but to men waiting unseen. The mechanic shifted his grip on the wounded crewman, adjusting weight to keep him balanced, feeling the muscles in his back and arms strain with each step as fatigue dug claws deeper into bone. Sweat mixed with grime and dried blood, streaking his face in uneven lines that burned when salt reached open scrapes. His breath came in ragged bursts, chest aching as smoke remnants scraped the raw interior of his lungs. Yet he continued, boots sinking into damp soil, pressing onward through the oppressive humidity that clung to skin like wet cloth. Behind them, the distant echoes of the battlefield faded further, dissolving into memory rather than sound. What remained were faint traces, the ghostly scent of burned fuel carried on a shifting breeze, the metallic tang of cordite drifting like a fading echo, the quiet, settling groan of cooling steel from the ruined tank that now lay half buried in the mud, abandoned not by choice but by necessity. The mechanic resisted the instinct to stop and look back again. The past was still burning behind them, but no flame remained to nurture it into purpose. The only direction that held meaning now was forward. The wounded crewman stirred, eyes fluttering open again, pupils dilated as pain fought consciousness for dominance. He whispered words fractured by breath, unintelligible but urgent, and the mechanic leaned closer to catch them. What emerged were fragments, names, places, half-formed memories spilling from a mind loosening its grip on the present. The mechanic spoke softly in return, his voice low and steady, anchoring the man to the moment, promising that he was not alone in this stretch of land where survival balanced, like a coin standing on edge. The crewman's hand clutched weakly at the mechanic's sleeve, his fingertips trembling from blood loss and shock, and the mechanic shifted his hold again, lifting more weight onto his own shoulders, willing his legs to continue. Birds called somewhere deep in the canopy above, their voices cautious, returning one note at a time to test whether the air was safe again. Small animals moved through brush, the rhythm of their footfalls quick and nervous as instinct pushed them back toward territory recently shaken by violence. The mechanic listened, noting how each returning sound sharpened awareness, the chirp of insects, the crackling snap of dry twigs, the soft suck of mud beneath boots. The jungle was alive again, but life returning always carried its own brand of danger. The silence of battle had passed, but now came the sounds that concealed threats rather than revealed them. The path sloped upward toward a ridge barely visible through layers of tangled vines and towering trees. The mechanic lifted his chin, focusing on the incline, as if climbing it would place distance, not only between them and the battlefield, but between them and the memory that trailed like a shadow, refusing to detach. Time stretched into something distorted, measured not by minutes, but by steps, each step a test of will against the drag of exhaustion. His muscles trembled, joints grinding, tendons burning as though frayed ropes barely holding tension. Still he moved, driven not by orders or strategy, but by the primal conviction that survival demanded motion and motion demanded refusal to stop. When they reached the crest of the ridge, the mechanic paused, lowering the crewman gently against the base of a thick tree whose twisted roots gripped the soil like knotted fingers. The crewman's chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven pulses, breath rattling like loose metal caught in wind. His skin had grown pale beneath the sweat and dirt, lips tinged with the faint blue that signaled blood thinning too quickly to sustain warmth. The mechanic pressed his fingers to the makeshift bandage, feeling the steady seep of warmth through fabric. He knew the bleeding had not yet stopped. He knew time was narrowing. He knew the distance to safety was still unknown, but giving in was not an option carved into his mind. War had erased the luxury of certainty. What remained was persistence. He reached into a pocket sewn into the inner lining of his uniform, fingers closing around a small metal flask dented from impacts. He unscrewed the cap and pressed it to the crewman's lips, tilting gently until a few drops slid into his mouth. The crewman swallowed weakly, closing his eyes as if the taste of water was enough to convince the body to continue its fight. The mechanic drank next, a small mouthful that burned down his throat like liquid metal scraping away ash. He capped the flask and slid it back into the pocket, ensuring the weight remained balanced against his side. He wiped sweat from his brow again, smearing new streaks of dirt across skin already stained with the signatures of combat. The wind shifted, carrying with it a distant sound, faint, irregular, metallic. Not battle, not gunfire, something heavier, slower, echoing rhythmically through the trees as though traveling over uneven ground. The mechanic stiffened, head tilting slightly to isolate the direction, every muscle in his body tightening in anticipation. He held his breath, counting heartbeats between sounds, gauging distance. The noise reappeared, the unmistakable clanking rattle of track movement, far but approaching. A tank, but not the one he had left behind. Another. Friend or enemy was a question with no immediate answer. He moved quickly, crouching to brace the crewman more securely, shifting him deeper into the shadow of the tree's trunk. He scanned the ridge's edge through gaps between branches, searching the jungle below for the source of the sound. The noise grew louder, accompanied now by the hum of an engine laboring under strain, the grinding of gears adjusting to incline, the rhythmic pound of metal links colliding with ground. The mechanic's pulse quickened, breath shortening, instinct coiling like a spring wound too tightly. He reached for the sidearm at his hip, a weapon small and nearly insignificant compared to the steel that had carried him moments earlier, and thumbed the safety silently. He did not raise it yet. A pistol against armor was an argument lost before spoken, but instinct demanded readiness. The sound rose, cresting the slope like a wave, and then through the trees a shape emerged, massive, rolling forward with deliberate weight. Sunlight glinted off the steel flank, revealing ochre paint dulled by mud and wear, a silhouette familiar and unmistakable. Not Japanese, American. Another Sherman, battered but intact, its turret sweeping slowly back and forth, machine gun scanning the ridge line. A white star emblazoned on the side appeared through drifting foliage, like an emblem of breath after suffocation. The mechanic exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and release, lowering the pistol to his side as tension drained from his shoulders in a sudden collapse of rigidity. The tank halted 20 yards below, engine rumbling like a low growl. A hatch clattered open, and a figure emerged, helmeted, uniform smeared with dirt, face drawn tight beneath sweat and urgency. The man shouted something up the ridge, voice muted by distance, but filled with enough force to penetrate the dense air. The mechanic cupped one hand to his mouth and shouted back, the sound raw and ragged, echoing through the trees. The figure below raised an arm in acknowledgement, then signaled to others concealed within the steel belly of the tank. The engine roared again, treads grinding forward as the machine began its ascent toward the ridge. The mechanic knelt beside the wounded crewman once more, hand resting firmly on his shoulder, steadying him as movement brought new pain to the surface. The crewman's eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus, widening with sudden clarity as he followed the mechanic's gaze downward. His lips parted in a faint smile, brief and fragile, but real, a flicker of light piercing the haze that had clouded him since the battlefield. He exhaled shakily, breath releasing tension stored too long, muscles loosening under the weight of relief. The tank reached them, brakes screeching lightly as treads ground into soil. The crew leapt from the hull, two men rushing forward, boots pounding against earth, expressions shifting from alert readiness to disbelief as they saw the mechanic and the state of the crewman he held. Hands reached down, strong hands gripping shoulders and arms, lifting weight carefully, securing the wounded man between them with efficiency born of repetition. The mechanic stood slowly, knees momentarily trembling from release, and allowed himself to lean back against the rough bark of the tree for a single breath, closing his eyes as noise surrounded him once again, voices shouting orders, metal clanging, boots moving, urgent motion replacing the stillness. The tank commander approached, removing his helmet and wiping grit from his forehead with the back of his hand. He scanned the mechanic's face, eyes narrowing with the unspoken question of what had happened, but the answer was already visible around them. The smoke smudged across the horizon, the faint echo of gunfire now replaced by jungle sounds reclaiming silence, the battered silhouette of the Sherman abandoned below like a monument. The commander placed one hand briefly on the mechanic's shoulder. Not a congratulation, not an apology, simply acknowledgement. A gesture that carried more than words could hold. The mechanic nodded once, slow, resolute. There would be time later to speak, time to recount, time to understand the full shape of what had transpired in the ravine where Steele had refused to die and one man had pushed the boundary of survival beyond reason. But now motion mattered again. Life demanded movement. He pushed off from the tree, straightening his back, breath returning steadier, muscles tightening with renewed purpose. He stepped toward the tank, boots sinking into mud, hands brushing against steel warm from exertion, climbing the hull with practiced ease. He paused at the hatch, looking back one final time toward the broken field beyond the ridge. Smoke still rose in thin threads from the wreckage of battle, and the ruined Sherman stood unmoving, its turret angled toward a sky now clearing from haze. It seemed smaller from this distance, less a machine and more a symbol carved from memory and steel, a reminder that in war, victory is sometimes built not from strategy or overwhelming force, but from the refusal to surrender when all logic dictates collapse. He dropped into the hatch, the metal interior swallowing him in a familiar embrace of confined space, oil-scented air and engine vibration. The tank lurched forward, treads clattering against stone, engine rumbling as it carried them away from the ridge, away from the battlefield, into a future still uncertain but possible now, carved open by one act of defiance against inevitability. The jungle closed behind them, erasing the path as though swallowing the story into silence. The mechanic exhaled slowly, letting his eyes close for a moment as the tank carried him onward. He did not need to look back anymore. The engine's vibrations settled into a steady rhythm that reverberated through the steel walls, a deep mechanical heartbeat, matching the cadence of wheels grinding against uneven ground. Inside the hull, the air was dense with heat, and the smell of fuel, hydraulic oil, and burnt powder residue trapped in the metal seems like a permanent signature of conflict. The mechanic rested one hand on the interior support rail to steady himself as the Sherman surged forward, each jolt sending a shiver through his bones already worn thin by exhaustion. The dim light filtering through the small viewing slits cast narrow bands across his face, illuminating dirt and dried blood caked into the lines around his eyes, marking the hours spent clawing survival from the edge of collapse. He inhaled deeply, letting the familiar industrial scent fill his lungs like an anchor pulling him back to something solid and real, something that was not defined by fear or uncertainty. Across from him, the wounded crewman lay secured between stacked rations and stacked ammunition crates, his body braced carefully against the interior curve of the hull to minimize movement. His breathing remained shallow and uneven, but steadier than before, chest rising and falling with the slow persistence of someone locked between consciousness and drift. The mechanic watched the faint tremor along the crewman's jaw, the twitch of fingers curling instinctively toward his chest as though gripping controls that were no longer there. Memories of the wreck returned unbidden, the explosion of flame bursting from the engine compartment, the screaming grind of treads seizing under torque, the shock wave hurling steel fragments like thrown knives, the choking smoke filling the turret chamber as vision narrowed to a tunnel barely wide enough to contain survival. He remembered hauling the hatch open with fingers slick with blood and oil, the weight of the unconscious body refusing gravity's orders, the deafening silence from voices that would never answer again. He forced a memory away, jaw tightening as the tank jolted over another incline. The commander leaned down from the turret ring, one hand gripping the edge of the hatch, the other steadying himself against the rocking motion. Dirt streaked across his face in uneven patches, sweat darkening the collar of his uniform. His voice carried over the rumble of the engine in a sharp, controlled tone shaped by urgency. They were moving toward the rally point, regrouping with armored units that had managed to break through the ambush zone. The battlefield they had left behind was not the end of the engagement, but a fracture point in something larger. A clash still unfolding across the jungle in scattered shockwaves. The mechanic nodded once, absorbing information without responding aloud. Words felt unnecessary, fragile, insufficient to contain the weight pressing against them from all sides. Outside, the jungle rushed past in streaks of green and shadow visible through the viewing slit. Sunlight cut through the canopy in fragmented beams, scattering across the tank's armor like broken glass. Branches whipped against the sides, scraping in rough arcs that produced a rasping screech of metal against bark. The ground shifted unevenly beneath the treads, mud sucking at steel with hungry resistance, then releasing with the wet slap of displaced earth. Every motion seemed amplified within the confined space. The whine of gears adjusting torque, the percussion of loose equipment rattling, the guttural roar of the engine swallowing silence whole. Inside, bodies swayed in synchronized rhythm, bracing instinctively against each shift. The mechanic's thoughts drifted uninvited to the men he had left behind, faces now carved into memory rather than reality, names he would carry as weight rather than comradeship. Their voices echoed in fragments stitched to sound without meaning, overlapping like distant radio signals struggling through static. He felt the familiar ache beneath those recollections, a tightening in his chest, not from exertion, but from the silent ledger war carved into the soul, with each loss recorded without ceremony. He pressed his palm against the cool steel wall beside him, grounding himself in the unfeeling solidity of metal, something that could withstand pressure without breaking. The tank slowed abruptly, gears downshifting with a grinding protest that shook the hull. The interior light flickered as the engine's pitch altered, transitioning from relentless advance to cautious approach. Voices rose from outside, low orders exchanged, short and clipped, urgency wrapped in discipline. The commander disappeared through the hatch, boots clanging against metal rungs as he descended to join the crew below. The mechanic moved closer to the gunner's position, peering through the narrow slit at the clearing emerging ahead. Sunlight opened across a wide patch of ground where two more Shermans stood angled defensively, their turrets pointed outward toward the jungle wall. Machine gun mounts positioned with precision, formed through repetition rather than thought. Infantry clustered behind them, weapons poised, helmets low, faces drawn tight like taut wire. The scene vibrated with tension, held just short of rupture. The tank eased to a halt alongside the nearest armored unit, treads locking into place with a sharp metallic snap. The crew disembarked, boots hitting soil in rapid succession, forming a protective perimeter around the wounded man as they lifted him carefully from the interior. The mechanic climbed out last, gripping the edge of the hatch to pull himself into open air. Sunlight hit his face, harsh and unfiltered, forcing his eyes to narrow against brightness that felt foreign after the dim claustrophobic interior of the tank. The shift from enclosed pressure to open stillness left him momentarily disoriented, breath catching as the world expanded again. He stepped down onto the ground, boots sinking slightly into soil softened by moisture. The other crewmen carried the wounded man toward a makeshift medical tent assembled from camouflage tarps stretched across wooden stakes. The mechanic followed, steps slow but steady, hands resting against his thighs to quiet the tremor running through muscles pushed past reasonable limits. The tent brimmed with activity, medics moving quickly, hands stained with antiseptic-tinged red, voices issuing orders layered with urgency and clipped efficiency. The wounded man was lowered onto a stretcher, medics converging around him with equipment already prepared. The mechanic stepped back, giving space, watching as gauze was peeled away, revealing the dark well of injury beneath blood-soaked fabric. The crewman groaned, breath catching in pain, and one medic placed a hand on his shoulder while another pressed a needle into his arm with practiced precision. The mechanic turned away, inhaling slowly through his nose, letting breath settle in his chest like weight redistributing. He moved toward the edge of the clearing, sinking to one knee beside the track marks left by the advancing armor, fingers brushing the indentation in the earth. The tracks formed lines leading in multiple directions, mapping a history not yet written, carved into soil as testimony to movement that would reshape the landscape again before the day ended. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the breeze shift across his skin, carrying with it the faint smell of gunpowder mingled with damp earth and distant smoke still rising beyond the tree line. The commander joined him silently, standing beside him rather than in front, both men facing the same direction without exchanging words. Their breathing aligned, steady and measured, as if synchronizing heartbeat with anticipation. The commander spoke at last, voice low and controlled, words shaped with the weight of command tempered by understanding. The fight was not finished. Units were regrouping. Intelligence reported additional Japanese forces moving toward the ridge sector. Artillery was expected. Recon aircraft were still grounded by weather. Their armor group had been cut off longer than expected, but communication had been restored. Orders were shifting. A counterattack would be launched once reinforcements arrived. The mechanic listened without moving, face set in calm carved from necessity. His eyes fixed on the horizon, watching thin strands of smoke drift upward in slow spirals. He felt his pulse steady as purpose returned with clarity, sharpened by resolve. He did not speak. He did not need to. The commander placed a hand on his shoulder again, brief, firm, meaningful without elaboration, then turned and strode back toward the rally point, issuing orders with crisp authority. The mechanic rose slowly, stretching muscles stiffened by strain, rolling his shoulders until tension cracked from joints. He looked toward the medical tent where the wounded crewman lay, visible through the parted entrance flap, medics working with swift precision. He watched until he saw the crewman's chest rise again, deeper this time, breath-filling lungs with force rather than desperation. The mechanic nodded once, a gesture not of closure but of continuity. He returned toward the line of armored vehicles, boots striking ground with renewed intention. He ran a hand along the side of the nearest Sherman, fingers trailing across the rough texture of dried mud and chipped paint, feeling every dent and scratch like Braille, reading the history of battles fought and survived. He climbed onto the hull, moving toward the turret ring with the smooth, practiced motion of someone who knew the machine not as steel, but as extension of self. The sky above cleared further, clouds breaking into fragments carried by winds shifting toward the west. Sunlight cast sharp edges across the clearing, illuminating the tanks in stark relief against the deep green of the jungle. The sound of engines starting echoed in staggered rhythm, one ignition after another, building toward a synchronized roar that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. Soldiers climbed onto armor, securing their gear, checking weapons, settling into positions shaped by habit and instinct. The mechanic lowered himself back into the hull as the engine beneath him roared to life, filling the space with thunder. He settled into position, hands gripping the supports, body bracing against motion. The tank lurched forward, joining the forming line, turning as one toward the direction of the burning horizon. The battle waited. The jungle breathed. Steel advanced, and the mechanic, covered in dirt, blood, smoke, exhaustion, and resolve carved from survival, closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again, gaze sharpening, spine straightening, jaw setting with the unspoken truth that had replaced everything else. There was still work to be done. The morning of November 25, 1944, emerged slowly from the haze, as if torn reluctantly from darkness. The horizon washed in pale light that cast a flat metallic sheen across the surface of the Philippine Sea. The ocean appeared motionless, a sheet of heavy gray steel stretching in every direction, the faint lines of distant swells moving like muscle beneath skin. The air was thick with humidity and the faint chemical scent of fuel, and the only sound was the deep vibration of massive turbines echoing through the steel bones of the USS Iowa. The ship felt alive, breathing in slow mechanical rhythm, every engine pulse sending a tremor through the metal deck and into the boots of the men standing above it. Sailors moved with silent efficiency, their faces tense, eyes fixed on the empty horizon as though expecting it to split open at any moment. There was no shouting, no final orders of preparation, no drama, only the quiet, suffocating pressure of anticipation. In the Combat Information Center, the glow of radar scopes illuminated the faces of operators leaning forward with rigid focus, headphones pressed tight against their ears, voices low and controlled as numbers and coordinates were exchanged like currency. Above them, on the open bridge, Captain John L. McCrae stood motionless, hands clenched behind his back, gaze locked on the distance. He had been through years of war, had watched storms of steel tear the ocean apart, had heard men scream under fire and engines die under sudden silence. But nothing felt like this moment. This was not chaos. This was precision building to impact, and precision demanded quiet. Far beyond visible range, past the haze that blended horizon into sky, the Japanese center force under Admiral Takeo Kurita cut through the sea at flank speed. unaware that the most powerful naval gun platform ever built waited for them over 20 miles away. Kurita believed he had escaped the jaws of the American carrier force, believed that surprise and momentum were now his only weapons after days of brutal attrition. He had lost ships, crews, and certainty, but he still carried the instinct that victory could be taken if speed and boldness replaced caution. He could not see the enemy. He could not hear them, but he assumed they could not reach him. Japanese reconnaissance estimates placed the maximum effective range of American battleship artillery at around 20 miles. Kurita had built his strategy on that assumption. He believed he was safe behind the curvature of the earth, shielded by distance his officers considered impassable. He believed his ships were ghosts beyond the horizon. He believed the ocean itself protected him. He did not yet understand that the ocean had changed. War had changed. Distance had become meaningless. Inside the plotting room beneath Iowa's armored conning tower, the Ford Mark I ballistic computer, an electromechanical machine of gears, vacuum tubes, rotating drums, and mechanical integrators, worked continuously, calculating firing solutions with relentless precision. It translated wind speed, humidity, air density, barrel temperature, roll, pitch, target vector, and the curvature of the earth into firing data. The operator's hands moved instinctively across dials, levers, and cranks, adjusting the numbers flowing through the analog brain of the machine. Above them, fire control radars traced moving shapes invisible to the human eye. Blips pulsed across the screen, like heartbeat monitors of distant giants. Nothing about the moment resembled the old world of naval warfare, where captains stared through binoculars measuring distance by sight. This was mathematics replacing eyesight, calculation replacing courage, cold logic replacing instinct. War without visibility. The crew inside Turret 1 waited in claustrophobic silence, surrounded by steel 20 inches thick. The curved interior walls painted the dull industrial green of machinery, designed without aesthetics or comfort in mind. Powder handlers stood by silt bags of propellant weighing hundreds of pounds, each one marked for precise burn characteristics. Shell handlers gripped massive 2,700-pound armor-piercing projectiles, their rounded noses blackened and oiled, waiting to be lifted into the hoists. The machinery towered above them like an industrial cathedral, its towering breech blocks gleaming beneath the harsh reflection of overhead lamps. The air tasted of grease, metal, and sweat. The vibration of engines thrummed through the floor. Voices were low and clipped, each man speaking only when necessary. There was no need for speeches. Every man knew what this moment was, the first long-range engagement of its kind in history. They had trained for it through endless repetition, but training never carried the weight of reality. In training, errors could be corrected. Here, errors killed thousands. On deck, the sky brightened fractionally. The sun still smothered behind a sheet of cloud that washed color from the world and turned every surface to monochrome. The sea rolled in slow, heavy motions, the ship rising and falling like the breath of a sleeping machine. Lookouts scanned the horizon through binoculars that revealed nothing but gray water and gray sky. One of them muttered quietly, almost to himself, "Feels like the world is holding its breath." He was right. The air felt pressurized, dense, electric. The tension so thick that words sounded muffled inside it. Then the command came. A single word delivered without urgency, but with weight that shifted the universe. Fire. The sound that followed did not resemble anything heard in nature. The ship convulsed as the 3 forward guns discharged simultaneously, a force like a tectonic shift tearing through steel. The deck shook violently, cables rattling, plates groaning, every bolt and rivet vibrating under the sudden catastrophic release of pressure. Flame erupted from the muzzles in blinding yellow-white bursts, expanding outward into smoke so thick it swallowed the bow. The shockwave hit like a physical punch, battering the lungs and rattling teeth, a thunderclap that rolled across the sea with the weight of an earthquake. Sailors instinctively tightened grips on rails and equipment as the concussion hammered their bodies. On nearby escort ships, crews flinched from the blast wave even though they expected it. Water exploded upward in a geyser of white spray as the force of the shot depressed the ocean surface beneath it. The projectiles surged into the sky faster than the eye could track, each shell longer than a man and heavier than a car, blasting upward on a high-arc trajectory that stretched more than 23 miles toward an enemy that could not see them coming. The shells climbed into the upper atmosphere, disappearing briefly into cloud cover, leaving faint white streaks behind them like scars cut across the sky. The crew inside the turret steadied themselves as the internal machinery roared to life again, breech blocks opening, hydraulic rams slamming backward to extract spent casing remnants. powder bags moving on overhead rails, fresh shells lifted into place with mechanical certainty. Reloading began instantly, the cycle designed to feed the monster without pause. War by rhythm, war by tempo, war by calculation. 40 seconds later, over the horizon, with the Japanese cruisers and destroyers cut through gray water at speed, the world split open. The first shell struck near the heavy cruiser Kumano, detonating beneath the hull in a pillar of water taller than the mast. Men on deck stared upward, stunned, drenched in seawater thrown like rain. Before they could speak, the second shell struck home. It punched through the deck plating of Kumano, traveled deep into the machinery compartments, and exploded with unimaginable force. Fire and smoke erupted from the center of the ship in a violent bloom. Fragments of steel hurled skyward, like shrapnel from a volcano. The blast tore open the hull, splitting machinery, igniting fuel, snapping power conduits, and slamming sailors off their feet. Some vanished instantly, swallowed by fire or shredded by metal. Others struggled to rise, faces burned, lungs choking on smoke. A roar drowned out thought. The cruiser listed sharply to port, water rushing in through a wound too large to contain. For a split second, silence followed, the stunned, paralyzed silence of men who could not understand what had happened. Then the third hit scored against Suzuya, the shock rippling through the line of ships like a physical command. Officers screamed orders. Helm wheels spun. Engines surged. Men raced to damage control stations. But confusion turned to terror when someone shouted the impossible. No aircraft, no shell splash, fire from beyond visual range. That statement echoed across decks in disbelief. Japanese doctrine believed artillery combat could not exceed 20 miles. Their ships were not maneuvering for evasive patterns. Their tracking teams were not calculating trajectories. Their observers watched the sky instead of the sea. They had no defense. Iowa's second salvo was already in the air. 12 minutes later, four ships vanished from formation. 3 heavily damaged, 1 sinking stern first into the Blackwater. Survivors diving overboard into oil-slicked waves burning at the surface. Communications exploded into chaos. Radio rooms flooded with shouts, overlapping commands, frantic demands for information. Static crackled. Signal flags rose and fell in desperation. Officers clutched voice tubes, faces pale with realization. It was not aircraft. It was not submarines. It was artillery. Artillery beyond sight. Artillery beyond imagination. On the Iowa, there were no cheers, no celebration, no triumphant shouting, only the steady rhythm of machine cycling, the unbroken concentration of fire control teams recalibrating trajectories, adjusting microangles measured in fractions of degrees. The guns thundered again, and again, and again. Each blast shook the ship like a heartbeat accelerating under adrenaline. Each recoil slammed metal backward into hydraulic buffers. Each shockwave rippled across the water, leaving a white, expanding ring. The horizon flickered with orange flashes barely visible through haze, but unmistakable in shape. Ships dying. The Japanese commanders stood frozen, staring through binoculars at explosions they could not trace. Kurita's face tightened with disbelief, breath shallow, hands gripping the railing until his knuckles whitened. He had expected close combat, torpedo runs, carrier battles, the clash of steel against steel within sight. Instead, he watched ships die without ever seeing their enemy. There is no courage against the invisible. There is only fear. And fear spread faster than fire. He whispered the only words he could find. This is impossible. And in that moment he understood the truth that changed everything. War had moved beyond honor, beyond bravery, beyond tradition, beyond the horizon. On the American decks, men stood silent, the shock wave of each firing cycle pushing against their chests like the force of a storm. Officers checked watches and firing charts, calculating the collapse of enemy formation in precise increments. The battle lasted minutes, not hours, minutes. When the guns finally ceased, smoke lingered around the barrels like breath from sleeping beasts. The sea was quiet again, except for distant echoes rolling back across the water like thunder fading into mountains. For ships gone, thousands of men lost, no American casualties, no enemy ever seen. The Japanese had fought for honor. The Americans had fought for precision, and precision won. The silence after the last salvo hung over the Philippine Sea like a shroud, so heavy and dense that even the wind seemed unwilling to move. The guns of the USS Iowa cooled slowly, heat rippling from the massive barrels in wavering lines that twisted the air. Smoke drifted in thin gray sheets across the deck, clinging to steel, settling in the seams of the ship like fine ash. Men stood motionless, hands still gripping rails and equipment, breathing hard, not because of exertion, but because silence after violence always steals breath. The battle that had unfolded did not feel like a victory shouted over flames. It felt like a realization, a revelation, a transformation. The sea stretched empty again, a quiet horizon unbroken by sails, masts, or gunfire. Somewhere beyond that horizon, survivors floated in fuel-slicked water, clinging to debris made from the bones of ships that no longer existed. Somewhere beneath the waves, thousands of men sank into darkness, sealed inside steel that would never rise again. There was no cheering on the Iowa, no outcry of triumph, no celebration, only the heavy weight of knowing that something irreversible had just been proven. Distance had died. The ocean was no longer a barrier. The horizon no longer offered safety. The idea of war itself had changed. The radio rooms aboard American ships received fragmentary transmissions, broken Japanese signals, static-riddled reports, desperate calls for assistance that dissolved into incoherence. The voices carried confusion, fear, disbelief. No one understood what had happened. No one could comprehend artillery fire from beyond sight. The human mind seeks explanation, and when none can be found, terror fills the void. On Japanese decks, officers stood amid flames and twisted steel, staring into the sky as if expecting aircraft to appear. None came. They searched the clouds for shapes. None existed. They peered through binoculars toward the horizon. Nothing. Only the quiet line between worlds. Some cried out that the Americans wielded gods. Some believed a new secret weapon had been unleashed. Some prayed. Some stood silent, their faces blank with shock, knowing they had witnessed a kind of death that stripped meaning from every doctrine of courage and sacrifice they had been taught. The samurai code had no instructions for dying without seeing one's enemy. When darkness fell, smoke hung over the sea in long drifting swaths, illuminated by scattered burning debris still flickering on the water's surface. Oil burned in ribbons, stretching across the waves like torn black cloth, catching sparks. The smell of fuel and scorched metal clung to the air like poison. The sea rolled without sympathy, swallowing wreckage, spreading flames into dissipating lines that flickered and died. Pieces of ships, twisted plating, splintered beams, fragments of hull identifiers floated alongside life rafts overloaded with sailors, coughing through chemical smoke and oil foam coating their faces. Some whispered prayers. Some wept. Some stared at nothing. Shock erased time, turning minutes into hours and memory into blur. Rescue ships moved cautiously toward the devastation, searchlights cutting slow arcs across the broken surface. Rescue was mercy, but mercy had no voice. It moved quietly, pulling men from water, lifting bodies that had grown cold, carrying survivors whose eyes stared wide and unblinking at images burned into them permanently. No one shouted orders. No one spoke of victory. The dead do not cheer, and those who survive do not cheer in their presence. News traveled quickly through the American fleet, moving from ship to ship in hushed, disbelieving tones. Officers gathered in strategic rooms under dim light, studying charts where enemy positions once existed, where ink marked cruisers and destroyers hours earlier. Now there were empty spaces. Lines representing formations ended abruptly in blank white. Entire columns erased. Military reports read like fragments. Target neutralized. Hull rupture catastrophic. Fire uncontrollable. Sinking confirmed. Yet none of these sterile words captured the truth, the suddenness, the violence, the precision, the silence. Battles once defined by hours of cannon fire, close maneuvering, and visible destruction had collapsed into a mathematically exact event lasting only minutes. War had shed its old identity. Heroism and close combat no longer determined outcomes. Machinery and calculation did. The age of the warrior died without announcement, replaced by the age of range. In Tokyo, intelligence analysts reviewed incoming field reports, tables of numbers, eyewitness accounts fragmented by damage and panic. Nothing aligned with existing doctrine. Officials demanded explanation. Admirals demanded answers. Engineers insisted the event was impossible, demanding proof of aircraft or torpedoes or sabotage. No one accepted artillery as an explanation, not because the facts were unclear, but because the truth was unbearable. A weapon capable of striking from beyond sight negated strategy, nullified formations, rendered defenses meaningless. A weapon that killed without being seen removed the logic of bravery. The idea that men could fight with honor became fiction. The empire that believed spirit could overcome steel discovered steel had evolved into something spirit could not reach. In the corridors of Naval Command, silence spread. Officers stood over maps, hands pressed flat against the wood, shoulders heavy, staring at symbols that represented ships now at the bottom of the sea. Pride collapsed into shock, shock into dread, dread into silence. Every nation watching the Pacific understood the meaning. Technology had overtaken courage. Precision had conquered proximity. Mathematics had replaced instinct. Radar had replaced lookout. Range had replaced vision. Warfare had become an equation, and equations do not negotiate. Equations do not feel fear. Equations do not hesitate. The Iowa steamed through the night, with all lights extinguished, a black shape cutting through dark water, wake trailing behind like a scar. Men on deck leaned against rails, staring down into the shadows, listening to the engines pulse through the hull like a heartbeat. Some thought of home. Some thought of the men drowning beyond the horizon. Some stared into the sky, where clouds drifted slowly across hidden stars. No one spoke loudly. Victory did not feel like triumph. It felt like witnessing the end of something ancient, the end of the world as it had been understood. They had proven what the world feared to admit. The ocean was no longer vast. The horizon was no longer distance. There was no safety in space. There was only reach. In the days that followed, the consequences spread not through battle reports, but through psychological shock waves that reshaped strategy across oceans. Naval analysts pored over charts calculating ranges, trajectories, strike arcs, risk tolerances. They realized that battleships were no longer instruments of visual combat, but weapons of blind destruction. Eyes no longer mattered. Courage no longer mattered. Only data, only numbers, only precision. The dependence on radar became absolute. The engineering of fire control systems became as vital as armor plating or propulsion. The world had entered a future dictated not by bravery or sacrifice, but by calculation. For Japan, the loss was deeper than ships and crews. It was the collapse of a worldview. The imperial belief that warriors could overcome machines shattered irreparably. Officers wrote in diaries that honor no longer had a battlefield. Survivors whispered that dying without seeing the enemy felt like being erased, not defeated. Admirals recognized that faith in spirit as a weapon was fantasy. There was no counter for mathematics. There was no shield against invisibility. Precision struck without warning, without sound, without face. And there's nothing more terrifying than an enemy you cannot see. For the United States, the engagement demonstrated something more than superiority of weapons. It revealed the shape of wars to come. Battles fought not by soldiers looking into the eyes of the enemy, but by operators turning dials and reading instruments. War not measured by distance, but by accuracy. Not fought by strength, but by algorithms. The crew of the Iowa understood they had crossed a boundary, and they felt the weight of it. They had not fought men. They had fought coordinates. They had not destroyed ships. They had erased positions. And erasure has no glory. In time, historians would describe the event as a turning point, a hinge between centuries, a moment when warfare left behind the age of heroes and entered the age of certainty. Certainty built not from conviction, but from mathematics. Certainty built not from sacrifice, but from engineering. Certainty built not from courage, but from reach. After that day, every navy on Earth rewrote doctrine. Every admiral reconsidered assumptions. Every nation understood that the next war would be fought by machines deciding the fate of men who never saw each other. Distance no longer protected the weak. Distance empowered the strong. The Philippine Sea returned to stillness, its surface smoothing over the graves below. Indifferent, endless, silent. The ocean forgets quickly. Waves roll. Salt erodes steel. Hulls collapse. Silt covers names. Time buries the noise of war beneath pressure and dark. But silence remembers what water hides. Silence holds the echo of guns that ended an era. Silence carries the last cries of ships vanishing beyond the horizon. Silence lingers after flame dies, after metal sinks, after the last shell lands. And when the sea calmed, only the echoes of range remained.